This is part 6 of chapter 9. The chapter is entitled Man and His Doubles, and this section is entitled The Retreat and Return of the Origin. And this is a chapter of Michel Foucault's book, The Order of Things. And I'm reading this without commentary. The last feature that characterizes both man's mode of being and the reflection addressed to him is the relation to the origin, a relation very different from that which classical thought tried to establish in its ideal genesis. In the 18th century, to return to the origin was to place oneself once more, as near as possible, to the mere duplication of representation. Economies was conceived on the basis of barter, because in barter, the two representations that each party made to himself of his property and the other's property were equivalent, since they were offering satisfaction for almost identical desires. They were in some alike. The order of nature was conceived, prior to any catastrophe, as a table in which beings followed one another in so tightly knit an order, and upon so continuous a fabric, that in going from one point of this succession to another one would have moved within a quasi-identity, and in going from one extremity of it to the other, one would have been led by the smooth expanse of likeness. The origin of language was conceived as the transparency between the representation of a thing and the representation of the cry, sound, or gesture, the language of action, that accompanied it. Finally, the origin of knowledge was sought within this pure sequence of representations, a sequence so perfect and so linear that the second had replaced the first without one's becoming conscious of the fact, since they were not simultaneous, since it was not possible to establish any difference between them, and since one could not experience the second as other than like the first. And it was only when a sensation appeared to be more like a previous one than all the others that reminiscence could come into play, that imagination could represent a representation afresh, and that knowledge could gain a foothold in this duplication. It was of little importance whether this origin was considered fictitious or real, whether it possessed the value of an explanatory hypothesis or a historical event. In fact, these distinctions exist only for us. In a system of thought for which chronological development resides within a table, upon which it constitutes no more than a line of a certain length, its starting point is at the same time outside real time and inside it. It is the first fold that enables all historical events to take place. In modern thought, such an origin is no longer conceivable. We have seen how labor, life, and language acquired their own historicity in which they were embedded. They could never, therefore, truly express their origin, even though, from the inside, their whole history is, as it were, directed towards it. It is no longer origin that gives rise to historicity. It is historicity that, in its very fabric, makes possible the necessity of an origin, which must be both internal and foreign to it. Like the virtual tip of a cone in which all differences, all dispersions, all discontinuities would be knitted together so as to form no more than a single point of identity, the impalpable figure of the same, yet possessing the power, nevertheless, to burst open upon itself and become other. Man was constituted at the beginning of the 19th century in correlation with these historicities, with all these things involuted upon themselves and indicating through their display, but by means of their own laws, the inaccessible identity of their origin. Yet man's own relation to his origin does not occur in the same way. This is because man, in fact, can be revealed only when bound to a previously existing historicity. He is never contemporaneous with that origin, which is outlined through the time of things even as it eludes the gaze. When he tries to define himself as a living being, he can uncover his own beginning only against the background of a life which itself began long before him. When he attempts to reapprehend himself as a laboring being, he cannot bring even the most rudimentary forms of such a being to light except within a human time and space which have been previously institutionalized and previously subjugated by society. And when he attempts to define his essence as a speaking subject prior to any effectively constituted language, all he ever finds is the previously unfolded possibility of language, and not the stumbling sound, the first word upon the basis of which all languages and even language itself became possible. It is always against a background of the already begun that man is able to reflect on what may serve for him as origin. For man, then, origin is by no means the beginning, a sort of dawn of history from which his ulterior acquisitions would have accumulated. Origin for man is much more the way in which a man in general, any man, articulates himself upon the already begun of labor, life, and language. It must be sought for in that fold where man in all simplicity applies his labor to a world that has been worked for thousands of years, lives in the freshness of his unique, recent, and precarious existence, a life that has its roots in the first organic formations, and composes into sentences which have never before been spoken, even though generation after generation has repeated them, words that are older than all memory. In this sense, the level of the original is probably to that which is closest to man. The surface he traverses so innocently, always for the first time, and upon which his scarcely opened eyes discern figures as young as his own gaze, figures that must necessarily be just as ageless as himself, as he himself, though for an opposite reason. It is not because they are always equally young. It is because they belong to a time that has neither the same standards of measurement nor the same foundations as him. But this thin surface of the original, which accompanies our entire existence and never deserts it, not even, indeed, especially not at the moment of death, when, on the contrary, it reveals itself, as it were, naked, is not the immediacy of a birth. It is populated entirely by those complex mediations formed and laid down as a sediment in their own history by labor, life, and language. So that in this simple contact, from the moment the first object is manipulated, the simplest need expressed, the most neutral word emitted, what man is reviving, without knowing it, is all the intermediaries of a time that governs him almost to infinity. Without knowing it, and yet it must be known in a certain way, since it is by this means that men enter into communication and find themselves in the already constructed network of comprehension. Nevertheless, this knowledge is limited, diagonal, partial, since it is surrounded on all sides by an immense region of shadow in which labor, life, and language conceal their truth and their own origin from those very beings who speak, who exist, and who are at work. The original, as modern thought has never ceased to describe it since the phenomenology of mind, is thus very different from that ideal genesis that the classical age had attempted to reconstitute. But it is also different, though linked to it by a fundamental correlation, from the origin that is outlined in a sort of retrospective beyond through the historicity of beings. Far from leading back or even merely pointing towards a peak, whether real or virtual, of identity, far from indicating the moment of the same at which the dispersion of the other has not yet come into play, the original in man is that which articulates him from the very outset upon something other than himself. It is that which introduces into his experience contents and forms older than him, which he cannot master. It is that which, by binding him to multiple, intersecting, often mutually irreducible chronologies, scatters him through time and pinions him at the center of the duration of things. Paradoxically, the original in man does not herald the time of his birth or the most ancient kernel of his experience. It links him to that which does not have the same time as himself, and it sets free in him everything that is not contemporaneous with him. It indicates ceaselessly and in an ever-renewed proliferation that things began long before him, and that for this very reason, and since his experience is wholly constituted and limited by things, no one can ever assign him an origin. Now, this impossibility itself has two aspects. On the one hand, it signifies that the origin of things is always pushed further back, since it goes back to a calendar upon which man does not figure. But on the other hand, it signifies that man, as opposed to the things whose glittering birth time allows to show in all its density, is the being without origin, who has neither country nor date, whose birth is never accessible because it never took place. What is conveyed in the immediacy of the original is, therefore, that man is cut off from the origin that would make him contemporaneous with his own existence. Amid all the things that are born in time and no doubt die in time, he, cut off from all origin, is already there. So that it is in him that things, those same things that hang over him, find their beginning, rather than a cut made at some given moment in duration. He is the opening from which time in general can be reconstituted. Duration can flow, and things at the appropriate moment can make their appearance. Though in the empirical order, things are always set back from him so that they are unapprehendable at their 0 point. Nevertheless, man finds himself fundamentally set back in relation to that setting back of things, and it is by this means that they are able to weigh down upon the immediacy of the original experience with their solid interiority. A task is thereby set for thought, that of contesting the origin of things, but of contesting it in order to give it a foundation, by rediscovering the mode upon which the possibility of time is constituted, that origin without origin or beginning, on the basis of which everything is able to come into being. Such a task implies the calling into question of everything that pertains to time, everything that has formed within it, everything that resides within its mobile element, in such a way as to make visible that rent devoid of chronology and history from which time issued. Time would then be suspended within that thought, which nevertheless cannot escape from it, since it is never contemporaneous with the origin. But the suspension would have the power to revolve the reciprocal relation of origin and thought. And as it pivoted upon itself, the origin, becoming what thought has yet to think, and always afresh, would be forever promised in an imminence always nearer, yet never accomplished. In that case, the origin is that which is returning, the repetition towards which thought is moving, the return of that which has already always begun, the proximity of a light that has been shining since the beginning of time. Thus, for the third time, the origin is visible through time, but this time it is the recession into the future, the injunction that thought receives and imposes upon itself to advance with dove-like steps towards that which has never ceased to render it possible, to keep watch in front of itself on the ever-receding line of its horizon, for the day from which it came and from which it is coming in such profusion. At the very moment when it became possible for it to denounce it as fantasies, the ideal Genesis described in the 18th century, modern thought was establishing a problematics of the origin at once extremely complex and extremely tangled. This problematics has served as the foundation for our experience of time, and since the 19th century, as the starting point of all our attempts to reapprehend what beginning and re-beginning, the recession and the presence of the beginning, the return and the end could be in the human sphere. In fact, modern thought established a relation to the origin that was inverse for man and for things. In this way, it sanctioned, but outwitted in advance and preserved all its power of contestation with regard to them, the positivist attempts to insert man's chronology within that of things, in such a way that the unity of time would be restored, and that man's origin would be no more than a date, a fold in the sequential series of beings, placing that origin and with it the appearance of culture, the dawn of civilizations within the stream of biological evolution. It sanctioned also the inverse and complementary endeavor to align the experience of man has of things, the knowledge he has acquired of them, and the sciences he has thus been able to constitute, in accordance with chronology, so that though all man's beginnings have their locus within the time of things, his individual or cultural time makes it possible, in a psychological or historical genesis, to define the moment at which things meet the face of their truth for the first time. In each of these two alignments, the origin of things and the origin of man are subordinated to each other. But the mere fact that there are two possible and irreconcilable alignments indicates the fundamental asymmetry that characterizes modern thought on origin. Moreover, this thought brings into a final light, and as it were, into an essentially reticent clarity, a certain stratum of the original in which no origin was in fact present, but in which man's time, which has no beginning, made manifest, for a possible memory, the time of things, which has no memory. This leads to a double temptation: to psychologize all knowledge of whatever kind, and to make psychology into a sort of general science of all the sciences, or inversely to describe this original stratum in a style that avoids all positivism in such a way as to make it possible, on this basis, to disturb the positivity of all science and to use the fundamental inseparable character of this experience as a weapon against it. But in setting itself the task of restoring the domain of the original, modern thought immediately encounters the recession of the origin, and paradoxically, it proposes the solution of advancing in the direction of this ever-deepening recession. It tries to make it appear on the far side of experience, as that which sustains it by its very retreat, as that which is nearest to its most visible possibility, as that which is, within thought, imminent. And if the recession of the origin is thus posited in its greatest clarity, is it not the origin itself that is set free and travels backwards until it reaches itself again in the dynasty of its archaism? This is why modern thought is doomed at every level to its great preoccupation with recurrence, to its concern with recommencement, to that strange stationary anxiety which forces upon it the duty of repeating repetition. Thus, from Hegel to Marx and Spengler, we find the developing theme of a thought which, by the movement in which it is accomplished, totally attained violent recovery at the extreme point of poverty, solar decline, curves over upon itself, illuminates its own plenitude, brings its circle to completion, recognizes itself in all the strange figures of its odyssey, and accepts its disappearance into that same ocean from which it sprang. In opposition to this return, which, even though it is not happy, is perfect, we find the experience of Hölderlin, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, in which the return is posited only in the extreme recession of the origin, in that region where the gods have turned away, where the desert is increasing, where the techne has established the dominion of its will. So that what we are concerned with here is neither a completion nor a curve, but rather that ceaseless rending open which frees the origin in exactly that degree to which it recedes. The extreme is therefore what is nearest. But whether this stratum of the original, revealed by modern thought in the very movement in which it invented man, is a promise of fulfillment and perfect plenitude, or restores the void of the origin, the void created both by its recession and by its approach. In any case, what it prescribes as thought is something like the same. Through the domain of the original, which articulates human experience upon the time of nature and life, upon history, upon the sedimented past of cultures, modern thought makes it its task to return to man in his identity, in that plenitude or in that nothing which he is himself, to history and time in the repetition which they render impossible, but which they force us to conceive, and to being in that which it is. And by this means, in this infinite task of conceiving of the origin and what is nearest to it and what is furthest from it, thought reveals that man is not contemporaneous with what makes him be, or with that upon the basis of which he is, but that he is within a power that disperses him, draws him far away from his own origin, but promises it to him in an immanence that will perhaps be forever snatched from him. Now, this power is not foreign to him. It does not reside outside him in the serenity of eternal and ceaselessly recommenced origins, for then the origin would be effectively posited. This power is that of his own being. Time, the time that he himself is, cuts him off not only from the dawn from which he sprang, but also from that other dawn promised him as still to come. It is clear how this fundamental time, this time on the basis of which time can be given to experience, is different from that which was active in the philosophy of representation. Then, time dispersed representation, since it imposed the form of a linear sequence upon it. But representation was able to reconstitute itself for itself in imagination, and thus to duplicate itself perfectly and to subjugate time. The image made it possible to reapprehend time in its entirety, to recover what had been conceded to succession, and to construct a knowledge as true as that of an eternal understanding. In the modern experience, on the contrary, the retreat of the origin is more fundamental than all experience, since it is in it that experience shines and manifests its positivity. It is because man is not contemporaneous with his being that things are presented to him with a time that is proper to them. And here we meet once again with the initial theme of finitude. But this finitude, which was expressed first of all by the weight of things upon man, by the fact that he was dominated by life, history, and language, now appears at a more fundamental level. It is the insurmountable relation of man's being with time. Thus, by rediscovering finitude in its interrogation of the origin, modern thought closes the great quadrilateral it began to outline when the Western episteme broke up at the end of the 18th century. The connection of the positivities with finitude, the reduplication of the empirical and the transcendental, the perpetual relation of the cogito to the unthought, the retreat and return of the origin, define for us man's mode of being. It is in the analysis of that mode of being, and no longer in the analysis of representation, that reflection, since the 19th century, has sought a philosophical foundation for the possibility of knowledge.